Thanks for tuning in to the Teslawyer show. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and also hit that like button. Also, if you want to get up to the minute notifications, you can click the bell. And as always, feel free to leave comments about this video or anything else you'd like to see.
Hello and welcome to the Teslawyer show. It's Tevin, your host, and today we're going to do a little Contracts 101 discussion. We're not going to go fully into all the details of contracts, but we're looking at enforceability of a breach of contract. This came up because someone listed on Craigslist a Tesla Model 3 for sale. They're asking $150,000 and whether or not Tesla could actually stop them from doing this. This came out as Electric posted about a couple months ago that when the employees were reserving their Teslas, that there was a clause in an email, not necessarily the contract, that stated that because employees are receiving special priority, all Model 3 cars prioritized to employees must be registered to you and or your family member and may not be resold for more than the original price. Reservation holders will agree to these terms when their order is placed. And that was a clause put in an email to employees. We don't actually have what the clause said in the contract that the employees have for the sale of the car. But we're going to assume that the contract is valid at this point because this person did buy the car. So there was offer and acceptance and the car has been sold. So in general, we're starting with the premise that the contract is a valid contract. And the general rule is that contracts will be enforceable in whole or at least in part unless they're illegal, unenforceable for some reason, or one of the parties had no right to contract. So, I mean, illegal contracts are basically contracts to do things that are unconscionable. I can't contract with you to kill someone. The court will not enforce those. And unenforceable contracts are, let's say, like the solar eclipse that happened recently. You contracted to rent space to watch the solar eclipse, and the person didn't allow you in the house. They're not going to then say, oh well, you have to rent the space to this person now, even though the solar eclipse has already passed. So there's no way you can perform that contract. But enforcing the contract is not the same thing as damages. You could be awarded money or a reimbursement, which would be damages and not enforcing the contract. And then the other thing would be no right to contract, which generally kids don't have a right to contract. If you're under 18, you can't be forced into a contract. And also, you can't contract for things that you don't own. I can't sell you the Empire State Building. Court's not going to enforce that. Moving on, we're going to say that, and in general, they're going to enforce the contract. If there is a clause that is not enforceable, but the general contract is enforceable, the court will let it stand and just try to cut out that piece that's not enforceable. So the narrow issue that we're looking at today is whether or not Tesla can limit the right of their employee or anyone else from reselling the car. In general, the courts will allow you to contract away rights. I know a lot of people think that rights are limitless. If I have a right to do something, you can't, it's unfettered. But the real truth about rights are, there's a famous saying, I don't know who said it, and it's been said many different ways. But in general, your rights end where my rights begin. Your right to swing your arms freely are good until you come into contact with my face or any other part of my body. So rights are not limitless, and people need to get over that. It's a fallacy. If you're going to live in a civilized society, then your rights have to be restricted to when they impact someone else. So it's not impossible to believe that the courts can allow people to limit the right to resell the vehicle. In this case, the employee is trying to say that they have some hardship, and that's why they're trying to sell the vehicle. Their claim, according to Electric, was a unique circumstance is forcing me to part with the car. And some people believe that this means that they're moving overseas or that they've left Tesla. But neither of those things have any bearing on whether or not the contract is enforceable. Just because they may no longer be a employee of Tesla or have left the country does not mean that this contract is now void. The contract is still valid because the time that a contract is valid is the time that you perform the contract, and performing the contract was selling the car. And they also look at the time that you signed the contract, making sure that there was no illegal inducement. You weren't coerced to sign this contract. You weren't forced to sign the contract against your will. If someone's holding a gun to your head or a loved one's to make you sign a contract, the court's not going to enforce that. But this is not the case. There was an offer and an acceptance, and there was some bargaining done here that of rights that the court could look at. I mean, the Model 3 is a unique good. Right now, there's only 150, 200 cars out there, and we know that demand is pretty high. There's estimates of 400,000 or more reservations. So at this point, I would consider the Model 3 to be a unique good, and that would go towards the court enforcing this clause and allowing Tesla to restrict the resale of the car. Even though it is someone else's property, you can, like I said before, you can contract away some of your rights or put limits on your rights. Like an employment contract, a lot of times if you're employed by a particular company that has a lot of high valued intellectual property and you're privy to that, or they have a particular business model that is unique to them and processes that are unique to them, they can restrict your right to work in that industry for a number of years after you've left that company. As I said, right now the Model 3 is a unique good, so that does go on, is in Tesla's favor. And they also didn't restrict your right to sell indefinitely. There's no time limit on this, which is probably not beneficial to Tesla, but of course their willingness to enforce this or to go after someone who breaches this clause of the contract will diminish over time. As there's more Teslas in the market, the less likely that Tesla will care, and also the less demand there will be for the car to be resold at a profit. So once we are at 50,000 Teslas, 500,000 Teslas, nobody's going to pay above market price for the privilege of owning a Tesla. But at this point, I could see people paying more, especially other car companies. Will they pay $150,000? Probably 3 times the price that the person paid for the car. It might be unlikely, but they can still get a healthy profit. At this point, I think there are people who would pay a premium to get the Model 3, even a used one. But I think the courts would look at this favorably for Tesla. It's not saying that you can't resell the car. If it was just a total ban on saying you cannot sell the car, I think the court would strike it and allow the person to sell the car. But they're just saying that you have to sell it for the original price, or at least close to that. So you wouldn't lose any money by reselling the car. So I think the courts may say that that's okay. I mean, we don't know exactly what this person's unique circumstance is, so the court will take that into account, and they may allow this person to make a larger profit than just the original price. The court may limit the amount that the person could sell the car for, maybe $70,000 on the $50,000, making a tidy profit, but not making 3 times the value of the car. I saw in the comments a lot of people talked about jurisdiction and whether or not Tesla could even enforce this contract against this person because they felt that they were either no longer an employee or have left the state. And actually, if they're no longer an employee, I think it gives Tesla even more incentive to go after this person. I won't say more incentive to go after them, but Tesla would be freer to go after them because they lose the aspect of retaliation. Courts frown upon retaliation, and if the person is still an employee of Tesla, retaliation would be not in their best interest. And we're looking at federal violations of the Equal Employment Act, and Tesla could get into seriously hot water if they did something against an employee based on them reselling the Model 3. All right, so some people in comments were speculating that this person is no longer an employee of Tesla, and that would be to their benefit. Well, it's not going to void the contract. You signed the contract at the time, and that's what the court's looking at. There are two big times that the courts look at for contracts: what happened at the time of signing and what the circumstances are at the time of breach of the contract. So there technically hasn't been a breach of the contract because the person hasn't sold the car yet, or we believe they haven't sold the car. The listing was taken down. They might have been contacted privately and have sold the car. So Tesla doesn't have a cause of action until they can prove that the person has actually sold the car and sold the car for more than the price that the car was sold for originally by Tesla. So first thing, we don't actually have a breach of contract at this point, so Tesla doesn't have a claim now. But we're working with the hypothetical that the person has breached the contract and have tried to sell the car and have sold the car for more than the original price, and we're trying to determine whether or not Tesla will sue them and what chance Tesla will have at actually winning. So one thing we gotta look at, if they're not an employee, then it actually is more likely, I think, that Tesla would actually pursue them legally because for breach of contract, because then they don't have to worry about retaliation or EEO violations. The person could claim that they're only going after them because they are, you could think that they're going after them because they're not an employee, but as an employee, you have more rights against the company when they take action against you. So, if they got demoted or they were passed over for a promotion or anything like that, then the employee could sue for retaliation because they breached this contract. And it takes it out of the realm of distinct third-party actors, Tesla as one party and the person who is selling the car as an independent third party. There is now a relationship as long as they're an employee, there's a stronger relationship than just a customer that walks in the door and is purchasing the car. So there's a higher duty that Tesla owes to their employees than to other people who are buying the car. So for people who thought that, if he's not an employee, it's better for him, actually, I think it's probably worse. Tesla has more reason to go after them to enforce this contract clause. Then other people speculated that the person is leaving the country or moved to a different state. So this brings up jurisdiction. Some people thought that if you left the country, this foreign country is not going to enforce the contract. Well, sorry. It's not going to, if you move to Chile or Barbados or Europe, doesn't matter. Tesla's going to drag you back to California. I'm almost positive 100% that there is a jurisdiction clause that states that any suit will be brought under California law in California. When the courts look at jurisdiction, there are a few different factors that they look at. First, foremost is where is the defendant home state. And in this case, most of the employees are in California, and that's their home state at the time of signing the contract. And if he hasn't left the country at the time of the sale of the car, then that would also be the place where they lived at the time of breach of contract. So that wouldn't be in their favor. If they moved after they sold the car, then it's not going to have any effect. The court's going to look at the home state of the defendant as being California because that was their home at the time of signing the contract and at the time of breach of contract. If they've already left the state and breached it, then they could have an argument, but that's not going to be the main. I don't think that will be the deciding factor. There's probably a jurisdiction clause, and the courts will uphold those as long as it's not prohibitive or punitive to the defendant. Another thing that the courts look at for jurisdiction is any state where the defendant has enough minimum contacts. And that also this would come into play if let's say the defendant was not in California, but they worked at SpaceX, and they were working in maybe the Texas facility, and they live in Texas for the launch pads, or they work on the launch pads or something, or they were just a shareholder and they live somewhere else and hold shares in in Tesla, and that's how they got into the employee early program. So what are we talking about? Minimum contacts? Well, where did the transaction happen? Tesla is going to argue that the transaction happened in California because that's where all the contracts are being signed. Where the car was sold? They're probably going to say that the car was sold in Texas. Keep going to Texas. Sorry, it was sold in California because especially the first 30 cars, all those cars were picked up at the factory in California. So that's another contact. And the person may be a shareholder in the company, so that's another contact. So it's stacking up that, California could still be, even without the clause, California could still be the place of minimum contacts. And this usually comes up in cases where people are transit, like if you're driving, you fly to Florida, you rent a car and you have a car accident, and you hit someone and they sue you. They can drag you back to Florida because Florida is where the accident happened and where the plaintiff is, and Florida has an interest in protecting its citizens. So they're going to want to apply Florida law to that accident. And I think the same kind of thing would happen here with California law if there was not a jurisdiction clause. Another thing they look at is states where contracts were negotiated or signed, and clearly Tesla is going to say that the contract was signed in California, especially if you did an online reservation. I mean, it's not online, is not any one location, and Tesla is going to say, well, it was on our servers. That's the place where the reservation was being held, and that's most likely in California. Another thing they look at is if a federal court is, if there's a breach of contract and involves a federal question. I don't think this would bring up a federal question for this type of breach. But there is the dormant commerce clause, transaction between states, but I don't think that wouldn't play. There would be a long stretch argument. The other thing is federal courts, if you and the other party are citizens of different states and the amount in controversy exceeds $75,000. That would have to be a fully decked out Tesla Model 3 with taxes and everything. May just get over the $75,000. I did a breakdown video on the cost when Tesla came out, and it did get pretty high up there. It was pushing, I believe, $71,000. But you could, with taxes and everything, all the other fees included, minus the federal rebate, you could say that $75,000 was involved and try to get it into federal court, but I don't think it's going to be federal court. So all in all, I think either way you argue it, jurisdiction would still be in California, and leaving the country, leaving the state is not going to affect that. Tesla is going to be able to bring you back to California. In the end, I think that the courts would probably uphold this clause. They're going to uphold the clause because it's not a complete restriction on your right to resell the vehicle, and you're not going to lose money selling it for the price of purchase, the original price. And of course, this is only going to be an important clause in the near term. As Tesla builds more cars, the likelihood that you're going to get a price above original is going to diminish, and Tesla will have less incentive to enforce this rule. Good luck on this employee. I hope everything works out for them. If this circumstance is more than just greed, as some cynics are out there saying that, greed is not a unique circumstance. But I hope it's not just greed. I don't think it is. I think most of the people who are purchasing these early cars really do want the car, and are not just in it for a quick turnaround or being speculative. And we've seen this from other car companies when they have a rare car. I remember Ferrari, when they had the LaFerrari coming out, they had a lot of restrictions on people. They did an extreme vetting process and restrictions on not allowing people to have the cars go into auto magazines to review them and to test them and to hook up data loggers, and also to compare it with the Porsche and the McLaren that were coming out at the time. It was very hard to get head-to-head with those 3 cars. But as I said, as the car becomes less unique, the ability for Tesla to enforce this contract and the need for Tesla to enforce this contract clause will go down. But the gist is, I think the courts would enforce this. It may limit it more than Tesla would like, or they might do a limited enforcement, allowing them to probably make a small profit on the vehicle. But I don't think they would. This clause doesn't strike me as specifically onerous or illegal. It's not just automatically illegal, and Tesla could not. I think Tesla could enforce this contract in the near term. Probably by the end of December or January, when there are a good number of cars out there, I don't think Tesla would stand much chance. But today, with only 200 or so vehicles out there, it might be worth a shot. But by the time the case actually gets to be heard, there would probably be enough cars out there, and Tesla would win anyway, because if they got an injunction against this guy to not sell the car in the next couple of months, then the value of the car would be diminished enough that Tesla wouldn't care. So, I mean, even if Tesla didn't actually win the lawsuit, they would probably win and stop this guy from being able to get $150,000 for this vehicle.
As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe by clicking on my logo, or add a comment. You can find me on Twitter at Teslawyer Show. And before you leave, don't forget to check out another one of my videos.